on a dépassé les normes recommandées aussi. Ça fait que les distances sont encore plus exigeantes qu'ailleurs.
Juste une question. Est-ce que les limites de 500 et de 180, est-ce qu'on aurait besoin de faire des tests d'eau et toutes ces choses-là s'ils étaient beaucoup plus éloignés? Alors pourquoi les avoir si proches?
Pour les essais d'eau, peu importe quelle distance que les puits sèchent, c'est un minimum. S'il n'y a aucun de puits à proximité en dedans de la zone, on a le droit aussi, le gouvernement peut exiger que l'industrie aille encore plus loin que cette marge-là. Parce qu'on veut s'assurer que le gouvernement ait ce qu'on appelle un baseline, qu'on sache qu'est-ce qui était la qualité de ces puits-là avant, pour qu'il n'y ait aucun doute. S'il y a quoi que ce soit qui se passe, qu'on savait qu'est-ce qu'était la qualité. Parce que dans certains endroits, c'était pas clair. Comme déjà au Nouveau-Brunswick, il y a des endroits où il n'y a aucune activité pétrolière aujourd'hui, mais qui peuvent déjà allumer leur eau, comme dans le fameux film Gasland. Ça existe, il y a des méthanes naturels qui reviennent à la surface dans les puits. Ça fait qu'on veut s'assurer qu'on a un compte rendu de la qualité de l'eau avant, puis comme ça, on peut poursuivre l'industrie s'il n'y a aucun dommage. Ça fait que peu importe la distance. Nous, on considère vraiment que la distance de 180 mètres de test sismique est adéquate et dépasse les normes qu'on voit ailleurs. On est la seule province, une des seules places qu'on a pu trouver en Amérique du Nord qui exige les tests d'eau avant les essais sismiques et après. C'est le premier pour le Nouveau-Brunswick. En ce qui concerne la marge de retrait pour les puits d'eau à proximité des forages, pour le pétrole même, ce site, c'est un chiffre, c'est un premier chiffre, un chiffre débutant. On a examiné les marges de retraite d'ailleurs dans d'autres parties, d'autres endroits où ils font ces activités. Et il y a différentes études qui vont sortir dans la prochaine année. Ça fait que s'il faut, on peut exiger encore plus de distance et encore plus de tests à la base aussi. Ça fait que ça nous assure, ça nous rassure d'avoir la qualité avant si quelque chose se passe. J'espère que ça répond à la question.
Merci beaucoup, M. Leblanc. Sir, monsieur.
Bonjour. Marc Davignon. C'est toujours difficile de suivre M. Leblanc parce que c'était quand même assez complet et assez élaboré. Puis je suis certain que si if the policy analysts of the province have a hard time finding somebody to help, I'm sure this M. Leblanc will help. It's quite complete. Merci, M. Leblanc. De mon côté, M. Leblanc a adressé beaucoup des questions que moi j'avais et je suis content que vous avez peut-être fourni quelques explications. Puis j'aimerais aller peut-être un petit peu plus loin dans ma question. Considérant que les compagnies peuvent avoir une variation dans la composition de leur slickwater et puis que jusqu'à date, on n'a pas nécessairement 100% de connaissances sur la composition de ça, quoique c'est dans les recommandations, de votre connaissance, quelle est la composition typique? What's the typical composition of that slickwater?
Merci beaucoup, M. Davignon. I'm going to ask Craig Parks, who's our petroleum geologist, to answer that. For those of you who came in, s'il y a des personnes qui font juste rentrer dans les dernières coupes de minutes, do we still have any? Si vous voulez, on a des répondeurs des écouteurs, excuse, pour la traduction. We have some translation devices here if you want them. Or if you're too shy to come up close to the stage, go see that guy right there. Merci beaucoup. Okay, Craig?
Sure. I can speak to the fracture fluids. What I would be talking, I guess, about would be the latest fracture treatments that were by Apache in the Elgin area. They had used sand proppant in their fracture treatment. They use a friction reducer. That's where the slick water portion comes from. It was a polyacrylamide was the component in that. They also use a disinfectant. It's a type of household bleach. I believe it's called Bactron. It kills the microorganisms that are in the water. Bacteria in the water can have a tendency to corrode the steel pipe, so they want to make sure that there's no bacteria within that. They also use types of salts, NaCl or bromide salt, to inhibit a lot of these formations with the shale in them have a tendency to have high clay contents. you know, upwards of 40%. And when clay has depending on the clay, but when it comes to contact water, it can actually swell. So they use salts within the water to try to inhibit the swelling of that. And the last ingredient that they used was HCl, or hydrochloric acid. It's typically about a 15% the laboratory dilution on that 15%, and that's used to clean out the perforations in the steel pipe, you know, between the wall rock of the reservoir and the steel pipe where they perforate it, to clean that out, because a lot of these formations they tend to have high calcium or limey components, and that helps to clean out those perforations that they've created.
Thank you. Now, a complimentary question, I guess, and of course appreciating that there is a pre and post water testing process, and I applaud the government for doing that. Having taken notice of it and having been exposed to it with some of my family members, I guess in layman's terms, dans les termes que comment des mortels devraient comprendre, okay, I'll be a translator's nightmare. I'll go from French to English.
That's all right.
But the question does apply to you, and I guess in layman's terms, when you look at the annex that's behind or that's attached to that water testing documentation that's given out to, and the way it is explained to residents of New Brunswick, it doesn't appear to me that the contents or the specific items contained in the slick water appear in that list of products for which the water is being tested before and after. It may be, it may not be. My point is, in layman's terms, I seek reassurance that they are or they are not being tested for the contents of the slick water prior and post drilling.
So if anyone you know in New Brunswick has had their water tested to date, the regulations or the requirements to do the pre and post testing for the drilling and seismic only came into place last summer. So no one has had their water well tested prior to drilling under the new government requirements. So prior to drilling of a petroleum well, of a shale gas well, or hydraulic fracturing. So there are requirements that you may have seen. I don't know if this was this year or would it have been 2 years ago?
No, this was this year. It would go about a month back, specifically on the Route 126.
So that was prior to seismic testing. So the parameters that you see there are general chemistry parameters, because seismic testing doesn't introduce any specific chemicals. We want to make sure that the bacteria is okay. What seismic testing can do, if it's, and you're using explosives in particular versus the vibricize, if it's done in too close a proximity to a house, which is usually much less than the 180 meter setback, it can shake the rock a little bit, which may lead to sediment falling out of the formation and leads to some turbidity, which may contribute perhaps to bacteria as well. It's usually short in duration and might last a few minutes or a day, and then it goes back. So the parameters that are in there are strictly to look at the seismic testing. We've also included nitrates because we want to look in case there's excessive loading of nitrogen because of the explosives that are used, although in all the studies that have been done, and we haven't seen that to be the case, but we're being proactive about that and being cautious. Prior to any drilling activity for an actual well, it's a completely different, well, it's not a completely different suite, but there are additional parameters included in that. For example, there would be more inorganic chemicals that would be assessed for, like petroleum products, as well as gas analysis is also done for that, to identify if there's a pre-existing naturally occurring gas in the well and what type of gas that might be. Is it biogenic or thermogenic? I won't go into the details of what that means, but for those who know, it should be a comfort. And so the test is done before and after. So it's a different suite, and those have not actually been released publicly yet because we're still finalizing the chemical list for that. There's no hydraulic fracturing taking place so far this year, and then there may not be any at all this year. So we're just finalizing those details with the Department of Health. release them.
So I guess a recommendation in that case, because I'm assuming the answer is that no, they are not being tested for the contents of the slick water as we speak.
Not today, because there's no slick water fracking happening. They're tested prior to the slick water. They'd be tested prior to the well pad construction and the drilling. If it's more than current recommendations, I think if it's more than 3 months, or I think it's 3 months between when they did the pre-testing to when they actually drill the well, then they have to do an additional test prior to hydraulic fracturing. So they could be testing the wells numerous times to ensure that there's been no damage to any water wells in the area. And at that point, the parameters would also, you would not be testing for specific slick water fracks in the beginning. You would be looking for things like chloride. The salts would be the first indicator. That's what you would see. Because the slick water components would be so dilute, you wouldn't be seeing it in a water well anyway. But you would be seeing, if there was an impact, the first thing you would see would likely be the sodium, the salt, because the flow back that comes up the well after the hydraulic fracturing is so salty.
So I guess
you taste it.
So I guess my recommendation here is that, and I accept your answer as being that you might not see it because it's so diluted in a volume. I am quite skeptic and concerned for the volume that is actually being pumped into the well. So I guess that is and if it's one of my concerns, I'm assuming that is one concern as well as some of the people in this room as well, because we at this time have no indication to the fact that the contents of the slick water will be tested before and after. And I guess if it's not a concern, and if it's not a health concern, then my recommendation, that should be, I guess, communicated, because at this point it is a concern.
The same time that we government put out the requirement for the baseline testing, the pre and post testing, they also put out the requirement for the full disclosure of the frac fluid chemicals themselves, the additives. There's been no full disclosure since then because there's been no hydraulic fracturing. But that will have to be disclosed. And in previous tests, we had inspectors on site. You can also confirm what is the quality of the fluids to ensure that they are using what they say they were going to use.
Now, as far as you answered this following question in part prior, because my question, what was the tombstone data or historical data used to recommend the setback increases? And in your professional opinion, are they sufficient to avoid any undesired consequences? And you did partially answer that question. And you did say that based on Alberta models and other models that they were more stringent. I guess my question is, they are more stringent, but are they sufficient?
The research shows that yes, they are. They're more than sufficient. If you'd like to leave your name, I can provide you. It's in the reference document somewhere. I won't go through it now, but we can provide you with the reference of the studies that we're referring to and the reference materials for how come we feel that it's adequate.
And if I go to the basis of my question, is that in my responsible citizen research on this, I did speak to some of the people in the industry that work and have worked in the industry as either on the rigs or in the industry as such, and some of their first-hand experience in Alberta. If you haven't had these discussions, I would encourage you to have it with them, and I could provide you with their names as well, is that they have witnessed some of these infractions or some of these taking place, or some of these consequences or negative consequences within the boundaries and